So growing roses in containers, of course, is something that we should all be considering when growing our roses, especially if you are living in an urban or densely packed suburban area. As Diane mentioned, I am from New York City. I actually live in Brooklyn. So this actually is something that I have to do because, as Gary said earlier, I have rositis. And I keep planting roses. So here you see the back of my house. This is part of my backyard. As you can see, we have attached housing here in New York City for the most part. Everything's densely developed. But all the roses you see here in this image, including all these climbers, are actually growing in containers. Believe it or not, when I made this presentation, I didn't take a lot of pictures of the roses in containers because I really wanted to focus on the beauty of the rose itself. But I will have some pictures of containers later to explain some more options you guys have. But yes, all these beautiful climbing roses here are all growing in their containers. And they are quite large bushes, as you can see. So let me get to, here we go. So one of the misconceptions about roses growing in containers, just to do a little bit of myth busting, is that roses in containers don't grow that well as roses in the ground. And I'm here to tell you that is absolutely false. As I showed you earlier, those beautiful climbers, just to go back there, the climber to the left is Purple Splash. You're seeing there going up against the rails. And the white climber there is actually climbing Iceberg, which actually does very well in my area. The rose there to the bottom right, I no longer have it in that position because I planted other climbers along my deck. But that bush there is actually Hansa, which is a hybrid rugosa. And it actually stood quite compact considering in its container. It actually didn't send out many runners, as a lot of hybrid rugosas would do, mainly because it's bound by its container. And then a whole bunch of other roses growing out in front. So here is a landscape shrub. You can grow a landscape rose very well in a container. This is Ringo All-Star from earlier this year in my garden. Lovely colors. I recommend everybody grow this one. Almost indestructible, this bush. Gorgeous colors that change over time. We can also grow David Austin roses in containers. I know many people on this call love David Austins. On the left here, we have Emily Bronte growing in a container here on my deck. And on the right, we have Munstead Wood. Both do very well in their containers here in Brooklyn. Once again, Purple Splash up close. Once again, we can grow wonderful climbers in containers. You just need a container big enough for a climbing rose. More about that later. We can grow beautiful hybrid teas in containers as well. On the left, we have Buxom Beauty, which I just planted in a container earlier this year. In the middle, we have Peach Swirl, which actually has a pretty good center on it, even though it usually doesn't do that. But it's growing wonderfully in this container I have here on my deck. And on the right, on my patio in a pot, is Dark Desire, beautiful dark colored rose as well. So yes, we can even grow hybrid teas that are capable of producing great form, even for those of you guys who like to exhibit hybrid teas. This is more than possible. We can grow minis in pots very well, in very small containers actually. So on the left we have Popcorn, and on the right we actually have Petite Knockout. And if you can see carefully there with Petite Knockout, it's actually that blue pot is actually more of a container holding its actual pot, which is the nursery pot it came in from Home Depot, actually. Another myth there we'll bust a little bit later in more detail. Roses don't need that big of a container to actually grow very well. And as you can see, these minis are doing just fine in a nursery style container. And yes, for those of you who love to exhibit, roses in containers can be prize winners. Here on the left, we have Tangerine Skies, a climbing rose. This was best climber at the Long Island Rose Society Rose Show last year. And on the right, we have Moonlight in Paris, which was the queen of shrubs. at the Long Island Rose Society Rose Show earlier this year in June. And many other roses I have in containers actually do get to the head table. These are just two examples. So for those of you guys who like to exhibit, container growing is still an option for you. So why grow roses here in containers? There's a couple of different options or reasons we might have. First is to maximize space, which Gary touched on a moment ago. I'm going to go into more detail about momentarily. Aesthetics in garden design, mobility and flexibility in design, and lastly, dealing with some fussy roses. So here in a container here, once again on my deck, is another English rose. This is Lady of Shallow growing here on a pot on my deck. And once again, you see climbing iceberg there on the other side of the deck, going all the way down from the patio. So that climbing rose, I mean, the deck is 8 feet off the patio. The railing is another 4 feet. That's 12. And the rose is much higher than that. So that one climbing rose is probably about, if I did my math right, probably about 16 feet tall that's going in a container. So once again, think about the possibilities we have in design by incorporating containers to grow even very large roses, right? So maximizing space as my first thing. So I showed you this image when we first started off. Once again, this is a patio in New York City. And on this patio, there is not much soil. In fact, if I skip ahead to the next picture, you can see an aerial view actually of my whole garden. This was my garden from last spring 2003. And you can see there's a large patio area. If you guys can see my mouse right over here, there's a deck. The deck plus the patio takes up half of my garden. I do have space along the edge of the patio where I can put plants in the ground. And I do that as well. There's roses all along the entire fence line that you see. There's some roses here and roses along the arbors as well. But if I don't put roses in containers, all this deck and patio space is effectively wasted, right? So we have to keep that in mind. And once again, thinking about how large roses can grow in containers, this rose here on the left, that's orange, that's tangerine skies. That's even taller than climbing iceberg. Sometimes it grows so tall it flops over and leans into the Japanese maple tree you see there. Very gorgeous rose, easy to grow in a container. And we see here in the deck all these beautiful roses all in bloom. It's a little messy picture on my deck because I was actually, as you might be able to see, I was planting another rose in a container. That container's right there on the deck. But that's what it is, maximizing space. So in this situation, going back to that other photo, these roses in pots all along the deck on the patio, they're able to climb up and actually create a quite stunning display what otherwise would have just been a bare structure because these roses are in containers. And actually what you can't see in front of these roses are actually even shorter roses. So just like in regular garden design, the climbers are on the back and the big pots climbing up the deck. The roses in front are hybrid teas and floribundas, and the minis are in front of them, creating almost like a 3-tier effect. So quite stunning appearance overall. Also, a maximizing space. You know, I don't have a lot of space to plant roses. So we see here in the image of the light, that's a miniature rose. That one is an old rose. It's long out of commerce. I actually got it from the rare rose auction. That is Wanaka, bred by McGreedy, if I remember correctly. And Wanaka there, as you can see, filled that entire container and is blooming tremendously. And well, it's hanging from my arbor. So I have roses climbing up the arbor, and I have roses in hanging baskets hanging from the arbor. Roses upon roses upon roses in this garden. Once again, maximizing space. This is the front of my house, as you guys can see here. Typical front of the house in New York City. My house is a two-family frame Victorian townhouse in Brooklyn. And as you can see, it's a lot of concrete. Can't really plant anything here unless we grow roses in pots. So this image is actually from a few years ago. I used this image so you can just see how much concrete there really is in front of my house. And now this picture was taken actually yesterday. We can see all the roses growing. If it wasn't so hot, we could actually see, more flowers on these bushes. But as most of the country's been facing high heat, as we all know, roses don't always bloom that well in the highest of heat. But I still have a few flowers here. Like this white rose right here, that's actually Moonlight in Paris. That was actually the Queen of the Shrubs photo I showed you earlier. Same plant. I have some Dave Austins growing along here. Like this one here in bloom is Gabriel Oak. And then right back here is All the Rage. It's hard to see. It's a nice big pink limb. I have roses all along the back of my house. It's hard to see because of the big Rose of Sharon in bloom. But behind the Rose of Sharon, there are some roses that are more shade tolerant going up the house. And then, not roses, but I still have other plants here. I have annuals here and hanging baskets, Delphinium. I also have here other annuals here in baskets as well. And I have a quite full appearance in front of my house that would normally be a concrete wasteland, in my opinion, or a concrete garden, as they would say. Once again, shows you options. As people pass along the street, they comment on all the fragrance of the roses when they're in bloom. But really good stuff. And once again, here's how my garden started in front of the house a few years ago with just a few pots. Later it expands. And one of those roses growing up the house is Princess Charlene de Monaco. Princess Charlene has a wonderful fragrance. It is shade tolerant, so it doesn't mind being shaded so much. And right now, it's actually halfway up those first story windows. The bush is that tall, and it's almost always in bloom. Wonderful rose for a container, especially if you want something that goes tall and perfectly straight. Just something to consider. Another thing we need to consider is aesthetics and garden design. So here's another rose I have in the container here. This is Easter Basket, which unfortunately is out of commerce, even though this is an excellent, amazing rose, especially for those of us in more cooler climates up north. But this rose here is in a container. And in my garden, just to go back quickly, we can see here in the grassy area, right down the middle, I have stepping stones. And I said to myself, do I really need those stones? Well, I want to put roses on those stones because the stones look quite ugly. But then I said, well, if I put it in the ground, that's going to be issues. I have to do maintenance. So why not put some of these roses in pots on those stones, cover up the ugly stepping stones, have more roses, and I can move them as necessary. And this rose grew very large and actually fills and overhangs out of the pot. It's in bloom most of the year. So just something to consider. We can use pots as part of our landscape when designing our gardens. This rose here is not a pot, but I couldn't help to take a picture of it. This is the fairy, it looks like. I actually took this on a trip to Maine last week. This is Bar Harbor. But the fairy is a rose. I put this here because the fairy is a rose that likes to hang. It kind of likes to drape out and over. So putting this in a pot would look really, really stunning, actually. I tried it here in my area. Unfortunately, in New York in the summer, it wasn't so happy. So I gifted that bush to a friend in a more northern climate. But for those of you who live in places like New England or the Midwest where it's cooler than what I am, this rose in a pot would look absolutely stunning, cascading over the edges of the pot. So the fairy's a really good rose to do, especially because it's really cold hardy for people in colder climates. It'll be much better able to survive the winter in a pot. We'll talk a little more about that later. And once again, aesthetics. So this is not my garden. This is a garden of one of our members from the Long Island Rose Society, Peggy Grimsley. I don't know if she's on this call or not, but this is her garden. People in my society who are on this call will recognize this photo. And once again, she didn't want to have the pathway just be empty. So she put roses in pots here, actually. And these roses, they're all hybrid teas, actually. The pots, once again, aren't that big. These roses are actually roses that are not very winter hardy. I'll get back to that in a second, but they're in pots. And it's part of her design. She cut them low because she doesn't like to spray so much. So she cut them lower to get them to reset from disease. But there we have it, another example of using pots in the landscape in a quite attractive way, especially when they bloom. Lastly, also we have to talk a bit about mobility in design. These roses, you might notice this image, they are on pots on wheels. What's great about this is that when it gets cold for winter, she can wheel them into that shed in the background. We'll talk more about winterizing later. And if it's really hot, she can actually bring them underneath the awning so they're sun protected as well, which is really good, especially for those of you who live, particularly in the southwest of our country, where you need to protect your roses from the sun. So if you're growing a rose that maybe might not be so heat tolerant, you might be able to put in a pot on wheels and move it at the moment's notice. And that's kind of the point with this idea of dealing with fussy roses. So if you live in a really cold climate and have a rose that's not reliably winter hardy, let's say, for example, like Ring of Fire or St. Patrick, or if you're in a really hot climate and you want to grow a rose, let's say like my favorite Blue Girl, which is not very heat tolerant, you can easily move these roses around. The rose here on the right is Coco Loco. Many of you may have tried to grow it. It's a very fussy rose in certain climates, definitely in my climate. Coco Loco, for those of you who don't know, was really bred to be drought resistant. If any of you grow this in the Southwest or have been to the Southwest, you probably see Coco Loco grows to be a monster. And that's because they don't get a lot of rain there. Here where I am in New York City in the spring, we get flooding rains. And flooding rains make these canes go yellow and the bush will probably die. After trying many times, I decided to do something unique. And what I decided to do was to take Coco Loco and plant it in a pot. And what I did was I mixed the soil with sand, actually, so the water drains right through. I also put this pot underneath the umbra of my Japanese maple tree. And as a result, the tree actually shields it from some rain. So the only water this bush gets is really water that I give it, and it mostly goes through. And the bush is actually thriving quite well. So you might have other roses like this. There's a few other varieties that don't really like rain so much. So this is another solution to you guys who live in rainy climates, for example. So, just other ways of dealing with fussy roses as part of container growing. So we now know why we want to plant roses in containers. So now we need to know how to actually go about doing this. Some of you may have had experience with this already. But for those of you who didn't have this already, we have here just a few things we're going to go over. So first, selecting appropriate roses for containers. Then we'll talk about selecting appropriate containers for your roses. Soil for roses in containers, planting the actual rose in care, and then we'll end with winterization for those of us who have to deal with winter. So first, selecting appropriate roses for containers. A lot of people actually don't know this. Roses in pots are affected by adverse climate conditions before roses in the ground. So first, we need to pay attention to our zone. Cold climate areas need to plant roses at least 2 zones hardier in their climate area. This is because, once again, the pots are affected before the ground is. A lot of people lose roses in the winter in containers because they say, oh, the pot flows solid. That's actually not so much the problem, believe it or not. We'll talk more about that later. The real problem with roses is that the pot will freeze before the ground. The ground freezes. That doesn't kill our roses for the most part. The pot freezing is not so much of a problem. The problem just is the rose is affected first if it's in a pot because the pot's exposed to the air. As we can see, there's a pot on the front of my house in the concrete. the air just wraps around that pot, so the pot will freeze first. So right now I'm zone 8 with the new mapping here in New York City. My roses and pots need to be hardy to at least zone 6, or they may not come back unless I take extensive measures to protect them. So most of my roses and pots are hardy to zone 6 and below. And then it's the opposite if you live in a warm climate area. Warm climate areas need to pay attention to heat tolerance. So just like how roses freeze before the ground does in the winter, in the summertime, roses and pots heat up first. So roses that are not reliably heat tolerant shouldn't be planted in pots unless you have some plan to move them around into a shady area and water them heavily. So we have to keep this in mind. And that just goes for any and all adverse climate conditions. So what this means is that even if you live in a really cold area, let's say you live in the upper Midwest and you're zone 4, there are roses hardy to zone 2. If you live in zone 5, you know, there are roses hardy to zone 3 that are quite stunning. I mean, one beautiful climbing rose as hard as zone 2 is Above and Beyond. If any of you guys ever grow that. Here it doesn't look so great because the heat kind of gets to in the summer unless you plant in a shady spot. But, you know, it's an option if you want a nice big climbing rose in a pot and you live in a cold climate. You know, just something to consider. Second, selecting appropriate containers for roses. Here's a little bit of myth busting here. Roses are not too selective about their containers, and they actually don't need very large containers to grow well. Some people who grow roses for many years might be screaming behind their computers saying that, how can he say that? But it's actually the truth. I've seen photos of people I know on social media where roses, especially in India in particular, they're growing big roses in pretty small pots, even smaller than I would feel comfortable with. But a 5-gallon pot is good for most large roses, although bigger pots are preferred for large shrubs and climbers. My climbing roses are in pots that are about waist high, and I would say around 2.5 feet wide, so they're a little bit larger planters. But my hybrid teas and my floribundas are in 5-gallon pots. In fact, the image there on the upper right that you're seeing, once again, that rose from the front of my house, that's a 5-gallon pot. And the rose growing in there is Sweet Mademoiselle, which is a large decorative type hybrid tea with English bloom form flowers. My mini, once again, we see here I have in the bottom left image there, a petite knockout. That's the pot it came in. If you look carefully, that's the nursery pot it came in. That pot says knockouts, lime green. You can see a sliver of the green. And I just thought the pot was not very attractive, but the pot's big enough for a mini. So what I did, I put it inside a more decorative container that I could easily move around, actually. We see here I'm holding up a 3-gallon pot in the picture in the upper left. This type of pot is a good pot to use. If you look carefully, that's not a saucer on the bottom of the pot. It's more like a reservoir. The inside of the pot has like little mechanisms that will draw water up from that reservoir, especially in hot weather. I would use a 5-gallon pot for a hybrid tea, but a 3-gallon pot might be good for a mini flora or a very large miniature rose. But that rose is really good if you live in an area with very hot summers. Very hot summers, those roses can do that. The pot in the upper right, getting back to that quickly, that's a very dark colored pot, but very decorative. Maybe not great for California, but really good in a cold climate area because dark colored pots attract the heat of the sun. As I said earlier, pots heat up before the ground does. So actually, a dark colored pot is a really good pot to have in an area that experiences winter where you want to winterize those roses outdoors. I'll come back to that a little bit later in the seminar. But even a hot climate or if you're willing to protect your roses other way, the pot on the upper left is perfectly fine. I put here on the bottom that brute garbage can container. The reason why I bring that there is because technically you can use that as a container. Anything can be made into a container. Anything you find aesthetically pleasing and easy to work with. I once knew a gentleman from New England, Clarence Rhodes. I know Craig here on our call knew Clarence Rhodes. I met him on a few occasions, and he would turn that garbage can, believe it or not, into a large container for roses. He actually planted 2 hybrid teas in that. He drilled holes all along the bottom so that garbage can would drain, and it's on wheels. So the reason why he did this, he lived in Maine, if I remember correctly. And in Maine, it gets really, really, really cold, and most hybrid teas are not winter hardy in that climate. And this gentleman loved his hybrid teas. So he was very ingenious here, and that he turned this into a container so he can easily wheel the roses into his unheated garage in the winter to winterize them. Then every late April, he would just wheel them back out onto his driveway, line them up, and they would grow into show-winning bushes. So if you don't mind the look of that garbage can, yes, you can use it as a container. I've seen people use Home Depot buckets as containers. They didn't care they were bright orange. They wanted a container that was quick and cheap. They drilled holes in it so it drains, and there you go, instant container. Anything can be a container. One rule, though, I'm going to put one caveat to that. No glass or ceramic pots. Glass and ceramic, first and foremost, can shatter if you have a really cold winter in cold climate areas. Glass and ceramic can also crack, break, and shatter if you need to move them around. And if you live in really cold climates or in really, really warm climates, you might want to move your roses around. So not a good idea. If you live in a really hot climate, ceramic pots lose water faster than plastic. Plastic is porous, but not as much as ceramic. Plastic holds water inside, ceramic does not. So not a good idea if you live in a very hot climate. Plastic is really what we want to stick with. You could use metal. I've seen people turn old wash tubs and metal buckets and pails into containers, but just remember, metal eventually over time will rust and might need to be replaced. But if you like the aesthetic, go for it. I've seen people use wooden containers. Once again, over time, wooden containers, even the most treated containers, will rot. I know that was my experience with a plant in a container. I had a rhodon in a container like that once, and the pot rotted. Took many years for that, but it did. So plastic is kind of quick and easy to go with for the most part. Soil for roses in containers. I'm going to say something else that some people might find controversial, but namely that roses are not too fussy when it comes to soil for their containers. Some people might want to make their own special blend for roses, of soil for roses. You know, the Consulting Roses Handbook says, you want sandy loam, so you want a certain amount of organics in your soil. That's great. I know I add rose tone, which is organic fertilizer, whenever I plant any rose, whether it's in a pot or in the ground. It's always a great thing to do for your roses. But in general, most big bags of good quality soil from your local nursery or big box store will do. So I just had some pictures. I used all these at some point, actually, for my roses and containers, and they all work. Miracle Grow garden soil is actually very effective. It has organics. It has light fertilization to get your rose off to a good start. It has good moisture control in it. And the best thing is it's $8 a bag for the biggest size bag at Home Depot. Readily available, easy to purchase, low prices, sometimes goes on sale. And the roses seem to love it. Some people would say, oh, well, you got to make sure you use potting mix soil. You could. I did. Personally, I found the garden soil to be better, believe it or not. I don't know the exact mechanics of it. These bags of garden soil, if you look at the one, the upper right, even says for in-ground use only. But almost every rose I have in a container, and right now I have about 80 roses in containers. Most of them have Miracle Grow garden soil for flowers, or Miracle Grow raised bed garden soil, or Miracle Grow just regular garden soil. Whatever was on sale is what I bought. They're fine, and they're growing big, and they're large, and they're loving it. So don't get caught up on that so much. Believe it or not, if you have a good pot with good drainage holes, that garden soil is not going to clog the holes. The rose will just love it and soak up all those wonderful nutrients. And garden soil in general has much more moisture capacity, which is really good in the summer, so you're not always watering your roses in containers all the time. That brings us to our next thing. How do we plant the rose in a container? Roses must be planted as deep in the container as they would be in the ground. A lot of people actually don't get this. This is how they lose their roses. So if you live in a climate where you would normally bury the bud union, you must do so in a container. I will repeat that again for emphasis. If you normally would bury the bud union in your climate, you must do so in a container. So here we have a typical container on the right. I actually went to Home Depot yesterday just to find a good container to illustrate this point. The other thing to keep in mind, we can use the decorative bands on the container as measuring markers when planting our bush. Some of you may have heard that solo cups can be used to measure, how much ice, how much liquor, and how much soda you put in if you want to make, a vodka Coke, as they would say. You can do the same thing with these containers. Those bands are there to help you. So if we look at the top of this container, I put my mouse right up here. This top band is where your mulch should be, especially in the winter. This second from top band here, where my mouse is, that is your soil line. And the crown or bud union should be below that soil line. So that way the bud union has at least 2 inches of soil above and at least 2 inches of mulch to winterize the pot above that. So that's the whole point. And as you might notice, many decorative pots have band here right in the bottom. That's really where your ballast would be if you were planting a really big landscape bush or like a tree or a kind of woody bush like a lodon or azalea to keep the pot from tipping. Roses, like I said, you don't really need that big of a pot, so I wouldn't put ballast. I would just put soil in all the way into that pot just so you have more soil for more moisture retention. But that's what that bottom ring is actually for. A lot of people don't know that. That's your measuring line for where to put gravel or rocks or something like that to keep a pot from being tippy in an area that's high traffic. So just something to keep in mind. All these bands are meant to help you properly plant your bush. And I want to reiterate, whether it's my rule for selecting roses being 2 zones hardier, whether it's about your use of containers, whether it's about the soil you're using, or whether it's about how deep you should plant your roses in this container and using these bands, this rule does not just apply to roses. It applies for any and all woody shrubs that you're going to plant. Rhodons, azaleas, butterfly bush, hydrangeas. This is what you should be doing to guarantee your bush in a cold climate will survive the winter. If you're in a warmer climate, it's a little bit different. But if you want your woody shrub to survive the winter, this is what you need to do to get it to survive winter and to grow properly. So really important about making sure you properly plant your roses in containers. And I have some images here Image on the right, as you can see, that's actually my father helped me plant the rose in the container. It's difficult for me to go up and down stairs. So he actually was very nice for me and carried this rose bush all the way to the top of the stairs for me in its pot. Just so I could take this picture of how to plant it for you guys. As you can see, he's probably not very happy from having to carry the rose up all those steps to the deck. But here we have, this is a bush that was actually gifted to me by my good friend Jackie Nye. This is Abraham Darby, David Austin. That's unfortunately almost impossible to find in commerce these days. So I'm very happy she gifted it to me. But as we can see, that rose bush, that crown is below that ring inside the pot, that measuring ring, as I said before. And now I'm going to fill that whole pot up to that ring with soil. We see here on the photo on the left, this is a different rose bush. This is actually another Austin Emily Bronte that I showed you earlier. This pot actually needs more soil. Simply put, that's a thick, high band. That soil should be halfway higher in that pot than what we already see. One thing I'm going to want you guys to keep in mind, when you put roses in pots, they routinely lose soil whenever we have heavy rain. So we had a lot of heavy rains earlier this year here in New York, not so much now, but a lot in April, May, and early June. This pot lost about 3 inches of soil. Right now, that's okay for this bush, but before winter comes, I'm going to want to refill that soil in that pot to make sure that crown is buried, just like I would if the crown became exposed in the ground. So we have to keep that in mind. Care for roses and containers. First, water. In general, roses in containers need more water than roses in the ground. Once again, those pots heat up faster than the roses in the ground. So as a result, they dry out faster. Dark colored pots especially need more water. So as I said before, if you're living in a cold climate, a dark colored pot is your best friend. But if you're in a cold climate that still experiences real summer, as many of us do, that means you need to be on top of it with watering, because those dark color pots will lose water even faster. And as I said earlier, use of pots with internal reservoirs is preferred. Irrigation systems can also be hooked up to pots. I can't find a good picture of it online. I water all my pots by hand, but there are drip line systems where you could run a line to a pot. They do exist. I seen them at the local nursery a while back. So they do exist for those of you guys who just want to use regular irrigation. Fertilizers are kind of the opposite situation of water. We want to make sure we're not over fertilizing our roses, since fertilizers don't leach out of pots as quickly as they would in the ground. So if I put fertilizer in a hole in the ground next to my rose bush or in my rose bush, when it rains or every time I water the garden, that soil is going to slowly leach out into its surroundings. It can't do that in a pot. A pot's basically a self-contained system. Oh, the fertilizer will run through eventually, just like water comes through. As I said before, soil is lost in pots. So it will run through, but if you over fertilize these pots, you may give them fertilizer burn, which we don't want to do. So for roses and pots, we really want to stick with organic fertilizers because they break down slowly, and they nourish the soil more so than they're nourishing the bush. So an organic fertilizer like Rose Tone, or some of you might use Mills Magic, is fine if used in the same quantities as the ground. So are liquid chemical fertilizers like Miracle-Gro when used as instructed. You know, Miracle-Gro is instant. You turn on the water, it dissolves. So as a result, that would run through a pot simply because when it rains or you water, it's water soluble, it goes through. Use of granulated fertilizers, I would do that only with abundance of caution. Granulated fertilizers are designed for slow release. You put that in the pot, it's going to slowly move through the pot. I remember I gave granulated fertilizer to my roses and pots, and the next spring when I went to give it again, some of the granules were still there. So if I wasn't careful, I would have gave it more granules and could have burned the roots of that plant. So if you give granulated fertilizer, make sure you use that sparingly and not frequently. Just keep that in mind. Water-soluble fertilizer and organics are the way to go. And once again, here we have a picture of my garden with more roses and hanging pots. As we can see, that Sweet Chariot, a nice winter hardy miniature hanging from the hanging basket. Really, really, really pretty. Another excellent choice. Lastly, for winterization of roses in containers. As you can see in this photo, this is my garden in the winter after it snowed earlier this year. So just to keep that in mind. Where I am, we have very mild winters. It snows actually very infrequently, but it could snow a lot if it does. The last 3 years in New York, in New York City, we actually did not have real snow. This is the first year we did, but it didn't last long. We had a very, very, very warm winter. It only went below freeze here, I think, 4 nights, one of which was the day it snowed, actually. But many of you live in climates that's very cold, and here in New York City, we tend to get the polar vortex where we can be like in the 40s, 50s, or even 60s for days in the winter, and then it drops to a single digit for a few nights. That does murder on the roses, quite literally. A lot of roses take a big hit. Some, if they're not mature, or some of them, if they were sickly the previous year, might not survive that. And once again, roses and pots are first affected. So it's really important to note, if you live in a climate that does get very cold in the winter, whether it's the whole winter or a few days like it does here in New York City, we want to make sure we're properly winterizing roses. The first thing I'm going to say, there are 3 proven methods to winterize roses in containers. The first method is to bury the container. Now, that is very simplistic. Obviously, as I said before, the ground freezes after the pot would. But if we're planting roses in pots, we probably don't want to bury the container because that kind of defeats the purpose of growing a rose in a container. But it would work if you had the space to do so. I had to do this once, actually, when I got a rose on clearance in December for $3. And I was like, oh, I already protected all my other bushes. I have this other one. I got it for $3. I don't know what to do with it. I'm like, well, where's a hole where I'm planning to plant the rose next year? Let me stick the pot in that hole for now and hope the bush survives. It did. So it does work, but probably not our best method. Method 2 is probably the preferred method, which is to move the roses to an unheated garage or shed. I'm stressing unheated garage or shed. The roses need to go dormant and stay that way for the whole winter. If they wake up during the middle of the winter in that garage or shed, they need water and they need sun. And if they don't get that, they will most likely not survive. So we want to make sure they're in an unheated garage or shed. So unheated means that it's okay if it goes below freeze. That's fine. The roses would freeze once again if they're in the ground. But being in that unheated garage or shed, they're not having direct contact with the ice or with the strong, drying, cold winter winds. And last method, this is the method I use because as I said earlier, in New York City, we have attached housing. So as a result, we don't have garages we can put the roses into. Most people in New York City don't have that luxury. Also, too, sheds. I have a little shed underneath the deck that can only hold a few small pots. So I can't hold all the roses I want in that tiny little shed because of lack of space. So the third method is to over the winters outdoors by mulching, wrapping, and corralling the pots in an area that is shielded from the wind. I'm going to go into that in a minute. The one thing I'm going to mention for all 3 of these methods that's very, very important to note. The roses that don't survive the winter in containers Most of the time, it's not because the plant died from the cold. They died because of desiccation, meaning that they dried out, in simple, plain English terms. If your roses are in that unheated garage or shed, they still need water. They don't need a lot of water, but they do need some water. The soil cannot be allowed to dry out. Simply put, soil cannot dry out. So the quickest way to test if your rose bush in your garage in that pot needs water, you stick your finger into the pot down to the second knuckle, and if the tip of that finger is moist, you don't need to give water. My experience has been I actually put 2 roses in a garage for my brother and sister-in-law for the winter. So, because I do maintain their garden as well, they only need maybe a half a gallon of water every 3 to 4 weeks. Because once again, they're dormant, they're not exposed to the elements, but they can't dry out. If they dry out, that bush is gone. If your roses are outdoors like mine are, they're overwintering outside. If it's above freeze for a few days and you don't have rain and there's no snow melt, you need to water your pots. And this is not just for roses. This is even for your other woody shrubs and ornamentals and evergreens. Some of you guys may have seen these beautiful evergreen plants, whether they be rhodons or arborvitae or anything like that, growing in a decorative pot, and you're wondering why in the winter they turn brown. Well, it's because there was no snow and not enough rain when it went above freeze. That's the simple point. Roses and pots cannot be allowed to dry out even in the winter. So there was a winter 2 winters ago here in New York City where just like this winter, it only went below freeze 4 times. We had days on end the 50s, nights above freeze. There was no snow and it did not rain for 3 weeks. I took out the hose. So we have to keep that in mind. Roses and pots must be moist in the winter. No matter what method you use for winterizing roses, you need to force your roses into dormancy. I would argue this is even the case even if you lived in a place like Southern California, because you guys don't have real winter and you need to kind of do this anyway to get them to reset. So this actually applies to people all across the country. You need to force your roses in dormancy. How do you do that? Simply put, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with this, you cut them back hard like you would in the spring. You can see images here of my roses and pots that are being prepped to be overwintered. They're all cut back down to strong canes. Strong canes being canes that are about as thick as your index finger. Nothing thinner than a pencil remains. That is, unless the bush is a new bush, then you want to keep as much structure as you can. But these bushes, you cut them back, you strip them of all their leaves, you rake any dead leaves out, you top off the pots with soil. As you can see, I've done that for some of these. In these photos, I filled them up to that inner ring that you can see, so those crowns are covered. And then they're sprayed with dormant oil. Dormant oil, so that way it smothers any fungal spores or any insect eggs that might be trying to overwinter on these plants. If you're bringing these into the garage, you are done. Just take these pots, put them on your dolly, wheel them into your garage, line them up. Just make sure they stay moist. If you live in a hot climate like California or southern Florida, you don't even need to do that. You do this as part of your standard pruning anyway. And in 4 to 6 weeks, you guys will probably see flowers on your bushes. Perfectly fine. In my case, I need to overwinter these roses outdoors. So I have to take a few more steps to protect these. And this is probably the situation that's going to face people in many highly densely populated cities. So in my case, all these pots are forced, all these roses are forced dormant. The soil's refilled that I lost throughout the year to cover those crowns. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to mulch these pots to almost the top. and any pot that's not darkly covered must be wrapped. So once again, pot freezes before the ground, but dark-colored pots, they attract the heat of the sun. They don't freeze as easily. Lighter colored pots, as you guys can see in the image to the left, I wrap them in plastic, black plastic, so that way they attract the heat of the sun and they don't freeze as easily. This also helps, believe it or not, this also helps prevent them from drying out in the winter when they're outdoors. What happens in some cases when you have a polar vortex, you get that really cold blast of air. The pot freezes solid. When the vortex goes away, the temperatures warm up, the roses want to break dormancy. They need water. They can't take water up from the roots because the pot is frozen. By using dark colored pots or wrapping your light colored pots in plastic, as you see here, the sun heats up the pot at the same time as the bush, so the bush is able to uptake water easily. Something to keep in mind. So this is actually a proven method. So mulch your pots, wrap your pots. Those minis that you see there, those little pots, those are miniature roses. They're put inside all the spaces between the big pots because, as you guys know, circles only touch at one point. So if you have 4 circles, 4 circular pots, you can put a miniature pot in the middle. It doesn't matter if that miniature rose gets absolutely no light. It is dormant. It's cold. It won't get leaves till the spring when you're ready to take this all apart. So don't worry about any of that. So we see here, I'm setting up the pots, I'm mulching them, I'm wrapping them. And then lastly, for any roses that I'm wondering, oh, there's a new bush. I don't know if it's winter tender or not. I don't know if it's exactly 2 zones hardy or not. It's not tested. I go through a further method of wrapping them. So this is actually one of my hybrid teas I'm wrapping here in this image. You, just like a rose in the ground, you can put a collar on them, mound them, and top them off with a rose cone. This is the new style rose cones you guys are seeing here in these images because many cities around our country are banning styrofoam. So the old-fashioned styrofoam rose cones are no longer available. These new ones do work very well, just so you guys know. So this I did for 2 of my hybrid teas that I was questioning their winter hardiness. They all survived very well, actually. So if you're planting really cold hardy roses that you know are cold hardy, this is not necessary. But if you're experimenting like I do sometimes, you can definitely give this a go. And then we want to corral our pots to a wind-protected area. So ideally, you want to put these up against the house. You want to put them in an area where the wind's not going to easily blow. My case, I can't do that because I have a deck. So I did the next best thing. As you can see in the image on the left, I put tarps up to create a windbreak. Now the wind doesn't easily blow. I have a sheltered corner for all my roses. Image on the right, this is what this looks like when this is done. All the roses are corralled, they're all wrapped. They all are winter protected. This was earlier in the, this was, I think, first week of December I did this year. And some of them are not protected in that wind protected area. That's fine. The roses I know are really cold hardy on that outer ring. So if they freeze from the wind, I know they're still good. Those roses are hardy zones 3 and 4. The roses hardy to 5 and 6 are in the back in the war shielded area. So just to give you an idea of how to winter protect these roses. So that brings us to the end of my presentation.